Movie studios are known to make some bad choices. Sometimes they make really bad choices, often including risks that, in the grand scheme of things, aren't too massive, but could result in billions of dollars of opportunity cost. Sometimes, though, they correct those mistakes. But in this video, I want to take a look at the near misses. These are the movies that studios either did reject or nearly rejected, but that were, through much grit and effort, able to find their way to the big screen. Several of these films had very troubled productions, but that's less important in this video. Rather, it's more of a celebration of them actually getting made. It's almost impossible to picture what Hollywood would look like now without Iron Man. It was a watershed moment for Marvel and, soon to be, for Disney. Along with Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy, Iron Man helped kick the superhero era of Hollywood into high gear and transformed the landscape. Mid-budget films were out, big-budget blockbusters that carried the weekend box office were in. It's almost easy to forget that it being made was not a sure thing. In fact, it's pretty unlikely that it got made at all and required an astounding level of risk from Marvel. Iron Man spent a long time in development hell. The first rumblings of an Iron Man movie trace back to April of 1990 when Universal bought the rights to make the movie from Marvel. This was before the comic book crash, at a time when Marvel was not only flying high, but getting larger through acquisitions. Universal ended up doing nothing with the movie, so it went to 20th Century Fox in 1996. And what a change 6 years makes. By this point, Marvel was on the precipice of bankruptcy, and by the end of the year, they would file for Chapter 11. Just 2 years before this, they had sold the X-Men film rights to 20th Century Fox for $2.6 million. When it was at Fox, both Nicolas Cage and Tom Cruise expressed interest in producing and starring in the film, while Quentin Tarantino expressed some interest in directing it, but yet again, nothing happened. Fox would sell the rights to New Line Cinema in 1999, saying that they already had enough Marvel properties. More progress was made at New Line than elsewhere. A script was actually completed and refined. Interestingly, and this is completely off topic, but David Hayter, the guy that voiced Solid Snake in the Metal Gear series, was one of the screenwriters. He also wrote the first X-Men movie. After turning in the script, Nick Cassavetes was attached to direct, but of course it all fell through yet again. Only then, in 2005, after being bounced around from studio to studio, did Iron Man land back where it all began, Marvel. Paramount would end up distributing the movie, but first they had to get into production. This was difficult. They had a hard time finding writers, and according to associate producer Jeremy Latcham, quote, "We went after about 30 writers and they all passed," end quote. In April of 2006, Jon Favreau agreed to come on as director, while a large panel was put together to help create the story and the script. This was a project that everyone took seriously because they knew that it would be make or break for the studio. You can see that in how they, or rather Favreau, landed on Robert Downey Jr. to play Iron Man. They went through a number of actors: Sam Rockwell, Hugh Jackman, Timothy Olyphant, Leonardo DiCaprio, and so on. But Favreau was set on RDJ after meeting him, saying, quote, "The best and worst moments of Robert's life have been in the public eye. He had to find an inner balance to overcome obstacles that went far beyond his career. That's Tony Stark," end quote. This was referring to RDJ's run-ins with the law and substance abuse issues, which he eventually did get sober from. A movie like Iron Man also does not come cheap. RDJ was paid just $500,000, which is big bucks, but far from the tens of millions he would earn on subsequent films. The movie had a $140 million price tag, which meant that Marvel needed a lot of money. They got a $525 million loan from Merrill Lynch and put up as collateral the rights to the characters that they still had, like Ant-Man, Black Panther, Doctor Strange, and Captain America. If Iron Man bombed, that would have been it. Instead, it pulled Marvel to heights I don't think the company could have ever imagined. With all the hurdles that it faced, it's a surprise that Star Wars ever made it to the big screen. That's a genuine surprise because by the time it came out, Lucas had already had a big hit on his hands. 1973's American Graffiti, perhaps the most successful independent movie up until that time. Prior to Star Wars, George Lucas had made two movies. One was the aforementioned American Graffiti, and the other was 1971's THX 1138, a sci-fi feature that was produced by American Zoetrope and was something of a cross between George Orwell's 1984 and Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. According to Mark Hamill, 1971, around the production of THX 1138, is when George Lucas also started to get the idea for Star Wars. He was inspired by the serials that he had watched as a kid, such as Flash Gordon. In fact, even before he got the idea for Star Wars, he wanted to adapt Flash Gordon. He tried buying the rights, but found that they were already purchased by Dino De Laurentiis. This set him on a wild goose chase, further and further into the annals of sci-fi. He found that Alex Raymond, who created Flash Gordon, was inspired by Edgar Rice Burroughs, who created Tarzan and John Carter, and who, in turn, was inspired by Edwin Arnold's Gulliver on Mars. He started developing the idea of the space opera, though it was still pretty half-baked at the time. Instead, he focused on American Graffiti. After that, he had to make a decision. Would he develop the space opera idea or work on the other movie he was developing, Apocalypse Now? He decided to go with the former because he figured he would have trouble getting the financing for Apocalypse Now. Well, much to his chagrin, he also had trouble getting financing for Star Wars. At first glance, it seems wild. Over its entire run, American Graffiti has made $140 million on a tiny $777,000 budget, yet Lucas got turned down by multiple studios. First, he took it to United Artists, then Universal Pictures. He made the latter a good chunk of money with Graffiti, but suddenly they got cold feet. It came down, as it often does, to the budget. Now, Star Wars' budget wasn't too expensive by any means. The final budget came out to $11 million in 1977, or $57 million today. That's mid-budget territory. Blockbusters spend more than that on marketing, but sci-fi and big budgets didn't mix well at the time, and a lot of studio heads had a low opinion of sci-fi in general. Francis Ford Coppola then brought it to the film division at Paramount that he ran with Peter Bogdanovich and William Friedkin, but the latter did not think that Lucas could pull it off, so they passed as well. Lucas then took it to, of all places, Disney, and while they certainly would warm to it decades later, they decided to pass at the time. The only studio brave enough to say yes was 20th Century Fox. All that credit goes to the studio head at the time, Alan Ladd Jr., who supposedly said to Lucas, quote, "I don't understand this, but I loved American Graffiti, and whatever you do is okay with me," end quote. To Fox's credit, they had an appetite for risk. Years before, they funded Cleopatra, and years later, they funded Titanic, both movies that could have sunk the studio, and in the earlier case, nearly did. Granted, Fox did get cold feet here and there, and would eventually say that they couldn't put in any more money after Lucas went over the budget, but the fact that it got made at all is a miracle in and of itself. If you've seen Pulp Fiction, you probably have a good idea of why it was rejected by studios. Just 30 at the time, and with his successful movie, Reservoir Dogs, behind him, Quentin Tarantino wrote his sophomore feature over several months in an Amsterdam apartment. He had written it by hand, and it was just a first draft, but it was the genesis of the movie that would be hailed as the best independent movie ever made. It brought John Travolta's career back from the dead, made Samuel L. Jackson a star, and would make disgraced producer Harvey Weinstein one of the most powerful people in Hollywood. When the screenplay was mostly complete after many revisions by May of 1993, it was time for Tarantino and his production partner Lawrence Bender to try and find a home for it. This turned out to be quite difficult. Now, Tarantino was no stranger to getting backlash from people about his scripts. When his manager, Catherine James, sent out the script to True Romance, she got an F-bomb-laden rejection in return. When they tried to shop it around, they first went to TriStar. Unfortunately, this was at a time when the government was particularly interested in how violence and drugs were represented in video games, on the screen, and in music, and whether or not that would impact the development of children. Danny DeVito, who had the script sent to him and who took it to TriStar because he liked it, was the one who made them aware of this. In his words, quote, "I read the script, which I liked a lot, and there was one scene that is really extremely violent, where they shoot someone in the back of the car and there are pieces of his brain splattered all over. The director and I had a discussion and I said, this is really over the top and you're going to get blowback," end quote. He was right. TriStar passed, and so did every other major studio, thanks to the violence as well as the drug use. But DeVito believed in the movie, so he kept taking it around, eventually landing with the Weinsteins at Miramax. At this point, Miramax was owned by Disney, but the Weinsteins had complete autonomy to fund whatever they wanted. Otherwise, Disney would not have touched this with a 10-foot pole. Still, thanks to the Weinsteins' appetite for risk, one of the most important movies of the 90s got made. Back to the Future is a certified classic. It spawned a successful franchise and is one of the most popular films from the 1980s. But it had a hell of a time getting to the big screen, and if director Robert Zemeckis and writer Bob Gale had any less grit, it would not have made it. See, most people can suffer a few rejections. It sucks, sure, but 1, 2, 3, maybe even 4 rejections and you're still hopeful. Once it gets beyond that though, people start losing hope. They start questioning themselves and wonder if what they're doing is right or if it's just some quixotic endeavor that's doomed to fail. If they make it to the double-digit number of rejections, then they're in the valley of despair. Maybe they've got nothing else going for them and this is their last shot. Once you hit a couple dozen rejections though, you've entered obsession territory. This isn't something you just want to do, it's something you need to do, and you feel that need on a very deep level. 40 was the magic number for Back to the Future. 40 times it was pitched and 40 times it was rejected. Gale and Zemeckis had known and worked with each other since their days at USC and had a development deal at Columbia, which produced their previous movie, Used Cars. The movie did not light the box office on fire, but it was well liked by Frank Price, the head of the studio at Columbia. Price wasn't sold on Back to the Future though, and so he put the movie in turnaround or in development hell. Gale and Zemeckis took it wherever they could, but found no biters. In a 2015 Esquire article from David Conow, quote, "Studios thought that it was too sweet, too nice, a Disney movie essentially, and it didn't fit at a time when the biggest comedies were R-rated raunch like Porky's," end quote. So they took it to Disney, where they were told, quote, "Are you guys out of your minds? You can't make a movie like this here. This is Disney, and you're giving us a movie about incest. The kid with his mother in the car, that's horrible," end quote. Another refrain they heard was, quote, "It's time travel. There's never been a big time travel movie hit. It's not going to make any money," end quote. The movie was too risque for Disney, not risque anywhere else, and about a subject that studios seemed predisposed to dislike. They were caught between a rock and a hard place. Now, they did still have a secret ace in the hole by the name of Steven Spielberg. Before they went on through the dozens of rejections, Spielberg said he loved the script and would be willing to attach his name to the project. That would have gotten it made. But Gale and Zemeckis didn't just want to rely on him. Zemeckis reportedly told Spielberg, quote, "Look, we're afraid that if we do this picture with you and it tanks, nobody will give us another job because we'll be those two guys that only get jobs because their buddy Steve signs on," end quote. So they had a pause for a while. Zemeckis needed to prove that he had the chops to direct a successful film. He got his chance with 1984's Romancing the Stone, a runaway hit at the box office that more than 10x'd its budget. It was all the cachet that he needed. People would now take him seriously as a director. Any studio would have said yes, but he decided to take it to the one person that believed in him and Gale from the start, Steven Spielberg and Amblin Entertainment. And so began the story of a movie that would run into several issues before making it on to the big screen. It's wild that Raiders of the Lost Ark and Star Wars are both on this list, but that's the way it goes. By the time Raiders of the Lost Ark came out in 1981, George Lucas and Steven Spielberg had, together, grossed well over $1 billion at the box office. That doesn't sound like a lot now when single movies clear that much at the box office, but that was a big deal back then when the idea of the summer blockbuster was pretty new. Spielberg had basically invented it just 6 short years prior with Jaws, which went on to gross hundreds of millions of dollars at the box office, as did Close Encounters of the Third Kind. But studios, though no doubt eager to work with the Hollywood wunderkinds, were hesitant about the deal. George Lucas, it turns out, was a very hard negotiator. You actually get the sense that he preferred the business side of movie making to the creative side. He explained it well himself in an oral history of the movie conducted by Empire Online, quote, "Raiders was turned down by practically every studio in town. They thought it would be a successful movie, but didn't trust the budget, $20 million. Second, I was asking for a very tough deal. It broke a lot of precedents that no one wanted to break. Its definition of profits upset their apple cart. The other part was I would develop it and turn it over to them, which gave them little control. They didn't like that. I had licensing, I controlled sequel rights, things that fed off what I did with Star Wars," end quote. Basically, he demanded that they front the cost, have zero creative control, and turn over licensing and sequels to Lucasfilm. Also, he would not let anyone but Spielberg direct the movie. That gave studios some pause because Spielberg did have something of a reputation for going over budget and over time. That was the case with 1941, his movie just before Raiders, which, while doing alright commercially, did not do well critically. Still, Lucas was a loyal guy. He pitched Raiders to Spielberg when they were in Hawaii during Star Wars' release, and he'd only let his friend direct it. Eventually, Michael Eisner, who was president of Paramount at the time, decided to negotiate with Lucas. Fine, Eisner said. Paramount would distribute the movie and provide the money to make it. Lucas and Spielberg would both get a handsome salary and back-end points. In return, however, Paramount would also get exclusive distribution rights to the sequels. Also, Spielberg had to stay within the $20 million budget and get the movie done on time. If not, there would be severe penalties. Spielberg, eager to refurbish his reputation, was happy with the deal, as was George Lucas. The two soon embarked on the making of a classic. E.T. the Extraterrestrial was the highest-grossing movie of 1982, and it could have been Columbia Pictures. In the grand scheme of things, it wasn't even that expensive to produce, just $10.5 million at the time for a movie that, over the course of its life, would end up grossing nearly $800 million. Spielberg had just finished Raiders of the Lost Ark and was looking for his next project. One of them was Night Skies, which was supposed to be a sequel to Close Encounters of the Third Kind. He discussed a subplot in the movie about a friendly alien that befriends a child with Melissa Madison, who wrote the script for what was called E.T. and Me at the time. Spielberg loved it and worked to refine the script before taking it to Columbia Pictures. Columbia passed on it though. They thought that it wasn't a commercial movie and would only have limited appeal to young children. They said no and put it in turnaround. So Spielberg went to Sid Sheinberg, his mentor that was president of MCA, which owned Universal. Sheinberg bought the script and struck a deal with Columbia where they would get 5% of the net profits. Columbia, of course, would end up regret passing on the movie. I'm not sure that anyone expected Rocky to be the highest-grossing movie of 1976. Sandwiched between 1975's Jaws and 1977's Star Wars, Rocky sometimes gets lost in the mix, but it's one of the most important movies made in the 70s. Not only did it launch the career of Sylvester Stallone in a big bad way, but it also kickstarted an enduring franchise. At the time, Stallone was down on his luck. He had been acting for several years by that point, but most of his roles were either small or uncredited. He had a baby on the way and needed to start making some real progress. In what I imagine was a frenzy, he knocked out a draft of Rocky in 3.5 days. It is wild to consider that this man literally changed the trajectory of his life in 3.5 days. Stallone's agents took it around town and several studios expressed interest in the film. They also rejected it though. That was because of Stallone's one major condition. He would play Rocky Balboa. That was an absolute must for him. If he could not play Rocky, the studio could not make the movie. He wasn't a big star at the time, so obviously many studios passed. The movie eventually landed at United Artists, who were also hesitant about Stallone thanks to the lack of name recognition. Rather, they wanted someone like Robert Redford or Burt Reynolds in the lead. That was a no-go for Stallone though. But his production partners, Winkler Chardoff, had a special deal with United Artists. So long as they kept a particular movie's budget low enough, they could greenlight it without further approval. They were able to get the budget to under just $1.1 million, though they would spend more on advertising later on. Still, Stallone got what he wanted. He said that he would have regretted it if Rocky was a big success and he wasn't the star. He had no need for regret this time. Rocky was a massive success and it would turn Stallone into one of the biggest action stars of all time. Blade Runner is one of the most important movies ever made. Ridley Scott actually turned the first offer to do Blade Runner down though. At that point, he was interested in doing the Dune movie that kept getting passed around, but development on it was moving too slow. Scott wanted something a bit faster to engage with after the passing of his brother, so he went back to Blade Runner. Unlike the other movies on our list, Blade Runner actually had a company willing to produce it. At Scott's behest, Filmways was willing to contribute $15 million to its production and $2.5 million to pre-production. Everyone thought that, money-wise at least, things were smooth sailing. They got the script written and acquired the rights to the name from Alan E. Nourse, who wrote the novel The Blade Runner with no spaces, and William S. Burroughs' adaptation of the novel Blade Runner, a movie. Now, neither of these works actually have anything to do with Ridley Scott's movie, Blade Runner. They just thought that it sounded sick, which is actually a pretty good reason to use the name. Unfortunately, as the date to start filming neared, Filmways got cold feet. They decided to pull their funding from the movie, putting the entire production in jeopardy. It's like going through the entire dating and engagement process only to leave the movie at the altar. But the production had a secret weapon, the producer Michael Dealey. Dealey worked some magic and in 10 days was able to secure $21.5 million in a three-way production deal between the Ladd Company, Tandem Productions, and legendary film producer Sir Run Run Shaw. Now, none of them would see their money back because Blade Runner did flop at the box office, but they still contributed to movie history. The adage goes, if at first you don't succeed, try again. Sometimes you need to try dozens of times before you do succeed. Most movies that we see on the big screen have run into countless issues at every stage: idea, development, production, post-production, etc. That they made it to the big screen is a minor miracle unto its own. Who knows? If you have a movie idea, it could be the same for you. You just might need to stick it out.